David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the show, and what a show we have for you today. Let's start with projection and voting. The level at which the right is projecting their actions onto the left has really come to a head on the topic of this recent Florida election and subsequent recount that is going on. It is now being reported that a heavily Republican county in Florida has allowed some residents, wait for it, to vote by email, which you might be wondering about. And yes, indeed, that is against the law. I'm going to reset the entire story for you so that we all sort of have all of the same information on which to base our analysis. So let's go back a couple of years. For years now, the right has been saying we need voter ID. We need all sorts of other voter suppression policies because of voter fraud, mostly perpetrated by the left, they said. People are voting for others. People are voting twice. Dead people are voting. Not really. Live people are going and saying they are people who have actually died. The reality is that that's not a problem, okay? There's been a huge meta-analysis by the Brennan Center for Justice, which found that there were, in something like 1.3 billion ballots cast, around 30 individual instances of fraud over like a 14-year period or something like that. I mean, the numbers were just infinitesimally small. So we cut to last week. The Florida elections happen. It's very close in the Senate race. It's very close in the gubernatorial race. And you see on election night, Republicans in the lead. Rick Scott in the Senate and Ron DeSantis apparently winning on election night. We then find out that there are a whole bunch of ballots which simply haven't been counted, many of them found at a mail handling facility in a liberal part of the state, Miami-Dade County, irregularities in Broward County, another one of the three sort of big blue counties of Florida that are responsible for a lot of the Democratic vote in these elections. We've got questionable ballots that voting machines disqualified that we need to look at by hand to really get a final tally. Republicans immediately say, oh, this is voter fraud by Democrats. They're sort of implying that Democrats dropped off bags of ballots after the election was over at a mail facility. And of course, there's no evidence of foul play or fraud. And if Democrats had a plan of swinging the election with bags of paper ballots, they would have, number one, gotten them in before Election Day actually took place. And number two, they probably wouldn't have dropped them off in a liberal area, since that would attract exactly this type of attention. So if Democrats are trying to steal the election with paper ballots dropped off late in a blue area, they are really doing something very stupid by way of, or in the hopes of swinging the election fraudulently. So over the last few days, we've had Republicans doing everything they can to oppose the recounts. Donald Trump claiming voter fraud with no evidence. Sean Hannity on Fox News saying someone should go to jail for this. And we've now learned that in a very Republican county in Florida, this is Bay County, where in 2016, Donald Trump had 71% of the vote in the presidential election. The election supervisor in Bay County, his name's Mark Anderson, he has admitted, he's not even denying, that he has allowed people to vote by email. This is against the law. This is not allowed. Now, you can argue we should have voting by email in the United States. We should have electronic voting. Or you could argue that we shouldn't. But what you can't argue is that we don't. So this is against the law. This is a form of fraudulent voting that the election supervisor has admitted to. Why did this happen? They say that it's because of the hurricane, but it's just not adding up, because after the hurricane on October 10th, Rick Scott, who is not only the senator-elect in Florida, he's also the governor, he put out an executive order saying we're going to extend early voting, we're going to add early voting locations, but no votes can be submitted by email or fax. Like, he specifically addressed that issue. And people were allowed by the election supervisor to scan or take pictures of their ballots and email them in. And the election supervisor is defending it by saying, we are simply taking care of voters. Pat, what about taking care of voters by making it easier to vote? What about taking care of voters by expanding voting locations or early voting, not because of a hurricane, but just because it's the right thing to do, or not purging voter rolls? No, they don't do any of that stuff. But now they want to help voters by allowing a Republican county to vote by email, which is against the law.
Yeah, sounds to me like voter fraud, and I estimate that anywhere from 3 to 5 million people voted illegally. My thought is that we have to put together a voter integrity commission to really get down to the bottom of this, because Democrats should have won both of these races.
It makes more sense here than it did after the 2016 election, that's for sure, because these are hundreds of instances of what Donald Trump claimed 3 to 5 million people did in 2016. Without any actual evidence. And while we're talking about Trump said he would prosecute all election fraud. Voting by email is a form of election fraud. Is it going to be prosecuted? I guess Rick Scott was right. There actually was a voter fraud problem here, but not in Miami-Dade County, not in Broward County, in heavily Republican Bay County. You cannot write this stuff. In completely inappropriate news today, we learned that First Lady Melania Trump ordered the firing of a national security staffer, and that person has indeed been fired. Mira Ricardel has been the deputy national security advisor to the president, working below National Security Advisor John Bolton since May of this year, May of 2018. And recently, the First Lady and Ricardel went to Africa, and it turns out that Ricardel was not getting along with Melania Trump's staff. One report says that the disagreements included where people were going to sit on the flight to Africa, not exactly serious life-altering stuff, but they weren't getting along. Ricardel also previously was having some conflicts with Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. There have been reports of tension between Ricardel and potentially soon-to-be-fired Chief of Staff John Kelly. That's another story about the chaos in the White House. And then yesterday, reportedly catching the White House off guard, Melania Trump's office put out a statement saying that, quote, it is the position of the office of the First Lady that Ricardel no longer deserves the honor of serving in this White House. And hours after that, we learned that indeed Mira Ricardel has been fired by Donald Trump. The First Lady publicly slammed a national security staffer. And reports are that neither Trump, nor Chief of Staff John Kelly, nor Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders knew that the statement was going to be put out. They were caught off guard. And indeed, that staffer has now been fired. The First Lady's office is making decisions about who handles national security in the United States of America. If you are National Security Advisor John Bolton, Pat, and one of your staffers has been fired because the First Lady didn't like her, what do you do now? What is John Bolton going to do about the fact that the First Lady is making staffing decisions for him? This is a new level of ridiculousness and absurdity, isn't it?
I don't know, because I think if you look at American history, First Ladies have had different levels of influence. Hillary Clinton, for example, was in charge of pioneering and championing universal health care and the Violence Against Women's Act. And I know that Melania has played a secondary role, like she's playing, a backseat position here in the White House. She hasn't been that vocal and active in forming policy. But if she wants to get a particular staffer fired, particularly one who hasn't been Senate confirmed, I think it's fair game. That's my take on it.
This is not Melania being best, as she likes to say. And just consider for a second, okay, so Hillary tried to do health care in the 90s. Fine. If it had leaked that Michelle Obama privately influenced the firing of even a speechwriter to Barack Obama, Fox News and Rush Limbaugh would have been covering it wall to wall every single day for months. This was a public statement about a national security staffer, the second in command to John Bolton, by the First Lady. This is actually an important job related to national security, and we're barely hearing a word about it from the right-wing media. They are pathetic hypocrites. And you can say, Pat, that Hillary Clinton was involved in trying to do health care. Okay, that's one thing. But Hillary Clinton was not, at least in this way, deciding through public statements who gets fired by the president of the United States. If your argument is, well, listen, David, this stuff is going on behind the scenes either way. This is just the White House, the First Lady's office, rather, making a public statement about it. It doesn't change the fact that this is actually happening behind the scenes all the time. Okay, well, we can look at that argument and then we can debate it on its merits. But the idea that Melania Trump knows anything about who should be in a position of ensuring the national security of the United States is unquestionably unfounded. I mean, we can't defend that, can we, Pat?
Do you see any difference between a national security staffer, someone who is not Senate confirmed, and say someone who is in a cabinet position, like a Secretary of State? Like, can you make a difference between the two of those things?
There is a difference, but either way, Melania Trump is not qualified to decide who is the number 2 national security person in the United States. Yes, she's not saying fire the Secretary of State. That would be different. But this is still plenty bad.
I feel like there are maybe 1,000 things that we can criticize going on in the Trump administration right now. And for me, this just doesn't rank that highly on the list. In regards to that right-wing media point that you made, I think that they're just way too busy covering the caravan, covering the midterm election recounts. There's a lot of stuff going on right now to fearmonger about.
Well, we've now got 1,001 things on that list, and this is certainly one of them. I got one email which said, hey, David, there's no way that Melania did this without approval. This is clearly a plot to distract from something else, maybe upcoming indictments from Mueller. Well, it did leak that supposedly Mueller indictments are coming soon, but this is a little too well orchestrated for it to be a calculated distraction. I don't even give them that much credit. Send me your thoughts. Are you more on the Pat side of the Melania dictating who is in charge of national security of the United States? Or are you more on my side of this? Or is there some other position we haven't considered? The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. I am on Twitter at dpakman. Follow us and let me know your thoughts.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let me say a quick thank you to Christopher Phillips, who's today's new member of the day. Thank you. We are mostly funded by viewers and listeners like Christopher Phillips. Also want to thank a longtime member, Rex Mitchener, who has been with us for 5 years. 5 years of membership. Rex has been with us since November of 2013. Christopher, Rex, thanks to both of you. Join them at www.joinpakman.com. We do depend on the support of our viewers. That's how the program is primarily funded. And I really appreciate everybody who has signed up over the last several days, including since the midterms. Okay, it is sort of a new era for Patriot Mail, the era of Trump. And we've seen the even further debasement of the hate mail that is coming in regularly. It's scary in many ways. It leads to more contacts with law enforcement, that's for sure. If you don't know what I'm talking about, what is Patriot Mail? This is Patriot Mail.
We're so alt-right, it's wrong. Patriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
Yeah, so it was Veterans Day this week, and we have a Patriot Mail here, I guess, in that theme from someone claiming to be a veteran, although can we really believe anything that Patriots say? I don't know. Let's take a listen to it together, see if we can make heads or tails out of it.
Look, cuck Pakman, if you served this country as I have, went overseas and saw what this so-called devout Mazoyam bastards did to our servicemen, you would be anti-Muslim too. So f*** off. Bleeding heart NPC beta cuck male loser. You keep getting better looking and more intelligent every day? Give me a break.
Who's saying that? That's not, he's arguing against praise that I've not actually heard made of me. But what you might notice there is that there's a big focus on masculinity. And today's voicemail later on in the show actually addresses that exact issue. So I'm going to come back to that. For now, I'll just remind you that you can send a message of a middle finger to the Hatriots by making a new membership at www.joinpakman.com with the coupon code Hatriot40. Every time you use the coupon code Hatriot40, 297 Hatriots cry, you get a membership at 40% off, and independent progressive media wins. HATRIOT is the coupon code. Use it. Unlimited uses are available right now. Very interesting new study about religious groups in the United States that I want to discuss with you. The fastest growing religious group in the country is no religion. In other words, people who don't associate with any particular religion. And this is not a new trend. This is actually something that we've been seeing for a while. Every time the Pew Religion Center does this report on I believe it's a yearly basis. And we're actually seeing the increased number of people not affiliated with religion have real measurable impact. So churches are closing all around the country, or are having to merge. Communities that used to have 6 churches, if you can imagine it, in some cases, are merging and combining and end up sometimes with only 2 or 3 churches. We're seeing more political candidates than ever not professing a religion. Many at the local level, more at the state level, notably Kyrsten Sinema, who recently has taken over victory of her Senate seat from Arizona over Republican Martha McSally, the first senator to not profess a religion. So we're seeing this more and more. And the Pew Research Center, as I mentioned, again has their study on this issue out. And not surprisingly, when we break these results down by age, the younger you are, the more likely you are to select none as your religion. If we're looking at the results here as we are together, you'll notice that the silent generation, born between 28 and 45, has nearly 90% of its constituents professing a religion, whereas baby boomers and more so Generation X and more so older millennials and even more so younger millennials at 36% profess that they are not affiliated with any religion. When people are interviewed about having left, typically it's their Christian church, merely from a numbers perspective. Most people in the U.S. at least nominally identify as Christian when they identify with a religion. People are asked, well, why did you leave? Sometimes they talk about, the teachings don't relate to real life. I don't feel like there's any connection between the teachings and my actual life, or the rituals don't mean anything to me, or I actually am just bored or uninterested in the rituals. There's a lot of that. But I actually have a more sort of evolutionary perspective on the fading of religion, Pat. For me, it's sort of like a survival of the fittest or natural selection kind of approach to the fading of religion in the United States of America. Historically, survival has been very accurately predicted by the ability of individuals and groups to cooperate. This can include in small numbers. This can also include in large numbers. And one of the big distinguishing factors between Homo sapiens and earlier humans and Homo sapiens and other species is that Homo sapiens can cooperate in very large numbers in flexible ways. So to give you counterexamples, chimpanzees can cooperate flexibly. They can cooperate in foraging or hunting or building shelters, simple shelters in some cases, whatever. But they can only do that in small groups. Like chimpanzees can't organize themselves in a group of 500. Bees are an example of a species that can coordinate in huge numbers. Beehives with thousands of bees, they can coordinate, but only inflexibly on very narrow tasks. If bees all of a sudden need to coordinate 5,000 bees to file a tax return, I mean, it's a dumb example, but on something bigger, they're not able to do it. And humans can cooperate flexibly in large numbers. Years ago, many, many years ago, being part of a religious group increased your chances of survival. People who help you, religion increased collaboration for in-group members. We know that that's the case. And therefore, you actually had a higher chance of survival, of living long enough to have children and pass along your genes. That is now less likely to happen. You're not as likely to suffer in 2018 as a result of being unable to cooperate with mankind because you're not part of a religious group. It's less necessary, it's less advantageous in 2018 to be part of a religious group. It's no longer an issue of survival not to be religious. If you look even today at places where you're less likely to survive as an atheist, there are fewer atheists. The evolutionary advantage to religious belief still exists in some places. Like, look at a country, Yemen is an example. In Yemen, the population says that religion is extraordinarily important to them. Something like 98, 99% of the population says religion is extraordinarily important. In Yemen, there probably is a measurably higher chance of dying before reproducing if you're not religious. Contrast that with some place like Norway or Sweden, some of the least religious countries in the world. There's no real advantage to religion in the survival sense. There's no cooperation advantage in Norway or Sweden to being part of a church or a religious group. So we can look at this a few different ways. Yes, the more we learn about how the world works, the more that science explains things about the world, the decreased need for religion is noticed. And that is a factor. But there's also this other sort of evolutionary angle. And there is one concern here, Pat, which is that religion being none is fine. But if people are replacing religion with this vague new age, not really religion, but pretty horrible ideas connected to pseudoscience, that's something I would be very careful about.
Are you saying that I should return all the jade eggs I bought from the Goop website, Gwyneth Paltrow's website?
Yeah, no more vaginal steaming, Pat. We've got to stop that. It's extraordinarily dangerous, and you need to tell everybody in your family who's doing it that they need to stop right away. And we're kind of kidding, but there are a lot of really bad ideas right now under the umbrella, not of organized religious belief, but more sort of agnostic teachings and anti-vaccine sentiment, the pseudoscience stuff that Pat's bringing up that's based on or advertised on Gwyneth Paltrow's website, Goop, the type of garbage that Dr. Oz promotes. It's really important to keep an eye on that. But the trend with organized religion is very clear. It's dwindling in the United States. And the biggest upside for me, like, you could say, David, we should care about people believing things without evidence, no matter whether they're doing it privately or publicly or both. Fine. We can argue it's not good for people to literally believe that if you eat shrimp, you're going to hell or whatever, right? I mean, whatever the teachings are. The biggest upside for me, though, is in the end, if people believe whatever they believe privately, if it doesn't impact what they want to have happen in the public sphere, if they are okay with total separation of church and state, I don't really care what they believe privately, although I might disagree with it. The upside for me of more people in the United States professing none as their religion is that it should allow it to be easier for our elected officials to be much more clear, much more direct, much more black and white on the issue of secularism, meaning a total separation of church and state. And that's a good thing because that's actually a principle the country was founded on. And now here's my question to you, or my proposal to you. If you're hearing me tell this story of people moving away from religion in the United States, and you think it's bad, if you think it would be better for people in the United States to remain more religious or to move back towards religion, please get in touch with me and let me know why. Why is it bad that people are moving away from religion in the United States? I want to hear from you. We will also ask for thoughts on this via our Instagram account, instagram.com/David Pakman Show. Make sure you're following us there. And also follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. You can find behind-the-scenes pictures of the new studio and much more. We will take a quick break. What a program we have for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It is great to be joined today by Carl Cederstrom, who's Associate Professor at Stockholm Business School at Stockholm University, also author of the book, The Happiness Fantasy. Carl, it's so great to talk to you today. And we're going to talk about an issue that sort of relates to an interview we did yesterday, actually, about how corporations and tech billionaires have in many ways co-opted what is sort of safe activism they're okay with, but that doesn't really challenge the status quo. And sort of related to that is the idea of the concept of happiness in Western society and how that also has been significantly influenced by the idea of happiness that is sort of useful or beneficial to corporations. So can we talk about that a little bit? And maybe first to begin with, even more generally, when we talk about measuring happiness, what are we really measuring? How can we do that? What are some of the methods that exist?
Well, there are a lot of methods out there, but briefly, I would say that we don't really know what we measure apart from what people believe to be happiness at that particular moment. And they've done really fascinating studies where they just make very, very minor changes to the configuration or the setting of one of these sort of happiness survey settings. And you could see that the change of the result is very significant. But let's say if you go back 2,000 years and hand out one of those happiness surveys, you're probably going to find about the same result that you get today. I mean, the average score is usually 7.5 from a 1 to 10 point scale. And what we lack is a definition of happiness, or rather we have too many definitions of happiness. We've got millions of different definitions. And it's because happiness is a philosophical question and we don't know what it is. And I'm afraid to say that we're never going to fully find out what it is, because it's basically tantamount to something as elusive as what does it mean to live a good, meaningful life.
So when in thinking about the difficulty of actually coming up with one sort of stable definition over a long period of time of what we mean, can you talk a little bit about how the perception of what happiness is has shifted in human history, just to sort of and introduce that idea to the conversation? What are sort of aspects of happiness that might have been prevalent thousands of years ago that maybe no longer are today?
Well, I think the major shift we see in the Enlightenment, because it's only then that happiness becomes something that we're not only supposed to strive towards, but something that we should attain. Prior to that point, happiness was something that we couldn't really achieve as human beings. It was basically the reserve of the gods. This was the idea of happiness in ancient Greece, for instance. You should pursue happiness, which to the Greeks was the same as trying to become an ethical human being and develop a set of virtuous faculties. And, during the Middle Ages in Christianity, happiness didn't really exist in the life on earth. It was something that you would get when you were dead for having done your duty on earth. So it's really only in the Enlightenment that we get happiness as something that we are able to attain. But even up to the beginning of the 20th century, happiness was still regarded as something that was very, very difficult, if not impossible to achieve, what you would find in works from Freud. It's only really in the 1950s that we begin to have this idea that happiness is something that everyone could achieve. And in the 1950s, the idea of happiness in the United States in particular was very closely bound up with the happy housewife who would spend her days with the kids and a husband who would go to work and then come home and ask for a whiskey, and the family would be all happy together. So it was a sense of happiness built around the family and security. And then, of course, just a decade after, in the 1960s, that changes in a very, very drastic manner when happiness is by no means to be sought or searched for within the family, but instead something that was about breaking free from the different norms and the kind of chains of societies. It was then very closely connected to personal liberation, personal growth, and living a life in freedom.
So would it be fair to say that we'll get to the more recent impact of consumer culture on the pursuit of happiness, but before we step into that, would it be fair to say that happiness maybe longer ago was considered more of a process, whereas now, or it shifted more recently to something that you can kind of achieve and that's it. You've done it and the chapter is sort of closed.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that. And obviously today, everyone is selling and offering happiness in all its forms. We even have, something you can drink that would offer you happiness, or you're supposed to get happiness from anything. So yeah, I think that's fair to say. It had a much more sort of long-term process perspective in the past than it has now.
So then we can now introduce the idea of consumer culture and products and services and wellness and all of this other stuff. Have we seen a decline in self-reported happiness in the time period since this consumer culture has developed? And if so, is it more acute in certain countries than in others?
It's impossible to say if the happiness level when you search, when you look at that, would have decreased or increased, because as I said at the outset, if you do this service, you would tend to get pretty much the same kind of answers. If you only focus on what people say when they are being asked, are you happy or not? But I think it's fair to say that the society we live in today, where so many people are living on very, very little money, and they are living under precarious circumstances, and they feel a great degree of anxiety and the rest of it, I think it's fair to say that there's a sense of unhappiness that has been very widespread, and which I would argue is strongly connected to material circumstances, people not being able to create a life that they are at the same time being promised. I think the crucial point now is that we're still being sold this idea that everyone could become a great success story through a kind of personal growth trajectory where you end up actualizing yourself. But then at the same time, you could see statistically that so many people, I think something up to a third of the American population, were under the poverty level for 2 months between 2009 and 2011. So I think it's a very kind of cruel vocabulary and jargon that we find, not least among politicians who would say that everyone could be happy if only they tried hard enough. And yet at the same time, we know that those same people, or very many people anyway, are living under very unhappy circumstances.
So it seems like there's sort of three ideas that I want to broach now and see what you think of them, which one is maybe more or less important, or just kind of get your thoughts here. Number one is that statistically, most people are not going to be sort of at the top when it comes to income, when it comes to wealth, right? Like mathematically speaking, the 1% is only 1% of the population. So that's sort of one problem in terms of expectations. Number two is this concept of hedonic adaptation, which is that once you achieve a new level of status, money, personal items that you now own and have access to, a bigger house, a more expensive car, you very quickly become acclimated to that. It becomes your new baseline, and you're not actually any happier than you were when that's what you were striving for long ago. And then number three that I would introduce is the idea that a lot of happiness or satisfaction is dictated not actually by what you have or have achieved, but how it compares to what others around you have achieved. And that's sort of where we get into a conversation about inequality and the negative impacts of that. These three issues, is there one in your mind that you think is most important? Have I mentioned something that you don't think is important?
I think probably the first one is the one that speaks to me most directly. And the reason for that is the way we think about happiness today is so deeply influenced by self-help literature and the self-help culture that has really come to dominate our lives. And there is one self-help book, which is very well known, called The Secret, where there's a collection of voices who would explain what the secret is. Basically, it's having find this law of attraction, which means that if you just put your mind to it in the right way, you will be able to govern your life and everything that happens to you through your own thought patterns. And they do say at one point there's only 1% of the people who have really figured out the secret. So in other words, and the point I'm trying to make here is that the kind of self-help culture that has come to define happiness for us today is really trying to depoliticize our surroundings, our circumstances, the lives we live, and basically say that anyone could be happy, but probably just about 1%, because it's only really those 1% who have put their mind to it. And that means that the 99% who don't have the same degree of power and wealth just have themselves to blame. And that is the kind of rhetoric that has become so prevalent and dominant in our notion of happiness. And that is something I find truly problematic.
So let's now introduce into this how corporations have sort of guided and defined the image of happiness that we have, really for their own benefit, right? For the benefit of selling the product or service that they offer. We can either, if you have specific examples, that's great. If you want to talk a little more generally about the role of the corporation and public relations and advertising in guiding what we see as happiness, either way, I think that's the next idea to introduce.
Yes, I mean, we could see a very significant shift taking place in the 1970s. So if the 1960s was a decade where a lot of people did want to break free from the demands they had felt previously, that they had to live this very boring, secure life, then in the 1970s, a lot of corporations were struggling to find ways of making work appetizing, and especially to try and attract young, talented people to the workplace. And you had several business gurus who hit upon what they thought was a brilliant idea at the time, which was that corporations and executives should start using the vocabulary of the 1960s, the vocabulary of authenticity, of liberation, of freedom. And so in the 1970s, more and more corporations really started to pick up on this language. And then in the 1980s, you could see how the really successful personal growth centers started to design courses, especially designed for executives and HR people. So people would leave their offices and they would go on these retreats to find themselves, but also to find ways of becoming more successful at their work. So you would find how the kind of spirit of personal growth, self-actualization, and finding inner meaning became sort of repackaged as a way of also becoming a better employee. And interestingly, in the 1980s, you would find some really well-known corporations, including IBM and Levi Strauss, using the exact same words and phrases that were developed in the 1960s around the human potential movement and human potentiality, first coined by Aldous Huxley, who was probably most known for the book Brave New World, but also for experimenting with psychedelic drugs and being a sort of pioneer in the 1960s movement of spiritual awakening and all the rest of that. And then other things are also happening in the 1970s. You would find personal growth seminars becoming wildly popular. There's one of them that I write about in the book, started by a man called Werner Erhard. It's a name that he took. The seminar center is called EST, Erhard Seminar Training, and people went there for a weekend-long training. And what they were being taught specifically was that there are no victims in the world. And also, if they only found the right way of thinking about the reality and themselves, they would be able to come back and change their lives around so they could become the person they really wanted to be. And so this is really a story. It's really during the 1970s and 1980s that a lot of corporations started to pick up on that. And then in the 1990s, we had the big boom of corporate cultures. And this has really is an ongoing trend. And we could see today really how it has culminated in some really bizarre examples. So for instance, there's a UK sandwich selling fast food chain where the employees, basically the people who stand by the cashier and sell sandwiches, are expected not just to be happy, but to be authentically happy. And there are cases how employees have been disciplined when they haven't lived up to this. So I think when it's come to that point, the corporations giving a minimum wage or close to their employees, and forcing them not just to smile, but to have that sense of, I am a liberated, free, authentic human being. There's something that isn't quite right. And that really is the bottom line of what I try to tell in this book, the history from how the idea of self-actualization and human potentiality, which made a lot of sense as a form of happiness in the 1960s, if you saw the contrast to the 1950s and how people felt really regulated and suppressed, you could see how from the 1960s to today, the notion of happiness and self-actualization have really been very important tools for politicians and corporations. But the result is that this is not, I think, a kind of happiness that one could truly believe in.
Yeah, I mean, the mandating of authentic happiness reminds me of a scene in the film Office Space, where the Jennifer Aniston character is told she doesn't have enough pieces of flair on her uniform, and she says, well, how many pieces do you want me to have? And the manager says, it's not about how many I want you to have, it's I want you to want to have more pieces of flair on your uniform. And it's that idea of sort of mandating a certain type of authenticity.
Exactly.
Very, very interesting. We've been speaking with Carl Cederstrom, who's an associate professor at Stockholm Business School and Stockholm University. The book is The Happiness Fantasy, which I encourage you to check out. Carl, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you. My pleasure to be on the show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So CNN is now suing Donald Trump and the White House and some White House staffers for revoking Jim Acosta's press pass after an incident involving an intern last week. And I know most of you have probably already heard about this issue. If you haven't, this all started during a moment at a press conference given by Donald Trump, during which CNN reporter Jim Acosta was questioning Donald Trump. And in so doing, Donald Trump sort of made it clear that he didn't want to hear from Jim Acosta anymore. And as you have seen maybe by now many times, a White House intern came over to Jim Acosta and started trying to physically remove the microphone from his hands. Jim Acosta persisted and sort of said, "Pardon me, ma'am." And at a certain point, his arm gets entangled with the White House interns. And the argument that the White House made after the fact for Jim Acosta's press pass being revoked was that in that moment, he put hands on a woman and that wasn't okay, sort of making almost like a violence against women type of argument as she as her and his arms became entangled. And what the CNN lawsuit is saying is that by revoking his press pass, Jim Acosta's First and Fifth Amendment rights were violated. Now, the First Amendment we know about, we're talking about freedom of speech. The government can't limit speech without a really good reason. The government can't limit speech on the basis of the viewpoint of a reporter or media outlet, for example. And it certainly seems as though Donald Trump doesn't like CNN and Jim Acosta for what he perceives to be their political point of view. And thus, the lawsuit claims Jim Acosta's First Amendment rights have been violated. Then we get to the Fifth Amendment argument, and that relates to due process. The government can't take away someone's property without due process. They took Jim Acosta's physical press pass, but they also took away sort of the pathway to him doing his job as White House reporter. And there was no due process, at least according to the lawsuit. The White House shared a doctored video of the incident and then said, we're banning him, we're revoking his press credential. And what CNN is asking for here is a preliminary injunction, which would immediately reinstate Jim Acosta's access to the press briefings. White House is saying that the lawsuit is merely political grandstanding. There is no denying that this has been really good for Jim Acosta's brand. He's gained hundreds of thousands of Twitter followers since this happened. If he was able to force his way back into the briefings, it would be fantastic for getting himself more attention. And it would be, I admit, amazingly awkward in the best way possible to have him back in the room there trying to ask Donald Trump questions. The real question is whether the arguments made in the lawsuit will stick, and we're going to see. There is precedent for a Fifth Amendment due process argument here. There's a case from 1977 called Sherrill versus Knight, and it involves a journalist named Robert Sherrill. And the decision from the court concluded that if the White House is going to deny or revoke a press pass, they need to follow a pretty specific process. And what it appears was the case here is that that wasn't done. The White House certainly might try to retroactively create a paper trail and argue that actually they did go through that process, but it doesn't appear as though that's the case. And we're going to see where this works out. You know, Pat, I mean, as far as the First Amendment, it's tough to argue, you know, CNN hasn't been banned. It's just Jim Acosta, whose press pass has been revoked. And if CNN can send another reporter there, you can probably make the case that First Amendment is not an issue, that Jim Acosta has no right to be at press briefings. I actually think that the due process Fifth Amendment argument on the basis of the 1977 precedent may be the stronger argument here. But do you think that this is a, quote, serious lawsuit, or do you think that it's to get something on the record and to keep getting the story more attention?
I think it's all designed to make it so that this is just a headache for the White House, and that the easiest thing for them to do is to reinstate Jim Acosta's press pass, because they don't want to go through legal proceedings over something like this. But hey, good on CNN for sticking by Jim Acosta. I was worried that maybe they would just replace him and that his replacement would ask much softer questions, not be as adversarial with Trump as Jim Acosta was. But no, they're going all in here, and that lawsuit shows it.
Yeah, and even Fox News actually put out an editorial earlier today saying, we are on the side of Jim Acosta here. We are against this revoking of press passes on what seemed to be more political and personality lines than anything actually journalistically wrong that was done, that we can definitively say. What I want to hear from you about in the audience is, do you think the lawsuit is serious? Do you think it's a way to get attention? Do you think it's both? Do you think it's something else? Let me know. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. I have something very exciting to announce today, Pat. I have been sworn to secrecy on this for months as it has been developing, and I am now cleared to tell you that the David Pakman Show is part of a select group of podcasts which are going to be part of Pandora's new podcast offerings. Pandora is this huge music discovery and streaming service. Many of you, I know, use it already. They have decided to jump into the fray with podcasting. They're going to launch podcasts sometime in the next 4 to 6 weeks. And this is just going to be huge for the David Pakman Show and for our podcast. We are already on Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and getting on Pandora is absolutely massive for us. Sometime in December, I am told, you will be able to subscribe to and listen to the David Pakman Show podcast on Pandora. This is, again, an invite-only, curated group of podcasts. And what else can I say, Pat? This is just great for the show.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of nervous. Do you want me to change anything about the production here on my end? How about my my tone and tenor on the show? Do we have to adjust in language police to fit Pandora's platform?
Oh yeah, we're going to be doing all sorts of language policing of Pat, and there's going to be there's going to be actually a list of banned words. Keurig is going to be one of them. Feral cats is not a phrase that will ever be allowed on the program again, and there's going to be a whole list of banned words for Pat now that we are on Pandora. No, I'm kidding. But listen, sign up to be notified. You can use, if you're watching on YouTube, there's a link in the video description. If you are listening, you can sign up to be notified about these new podcast offerings on Pandora. The website is pandorapodcastbeta.splashthat.com. pandorapodcastbeta.splashthat.com. This is all good for what I believe are going to be the biggest 2 years in politics since the David Pakman Show went on the air. These next 2 years, I've been talking about that now for a week since the midterms, and possibly the biggest 2 years politically in my lifetime, at least maybe American politics at this time. A lot is riding on the next 2 years. Membership, Patreon, subscribe to the Pandora beta, subscribe on YouTube, anything, all of it, all much appreciated. We've got a voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. Today's voicemail relates to something that has really become an issue, actually, over the last several years, and particularly under Donald Trump for Republicans. And the topic is masculinity. Let's take a listen to today's voicemail.
Hey, David. Real big fan of the show. I kind of want to ask you a strange question. You sometimes mention that Trump supporters really want him to be sort of the alpha in the room. And I guess I just wanted to ask about that more broadly, because it surprisingly does come up quite a bit. This sort of fixation, mostly by conservatives, on masculinity. Like Jesse Lee Peterson asking you, what is a man? You're very familiar with the kind of need to emasculate, call people cuck. It's funny, but it comes up. What is that? Do you think it's a sort of just a psychological glitch? Like, I know how likely you are to be discuss sensitivity is positively correlated with conservatism. Is it something like that? Is it something else? And secondly, since you've dealt with quite a bit being in the media yourself, how do you manage with people like that? And do you even push back? Is it worth it? Thanks.
So the second part is sort of easier for me, which is that if someone's main critiques of me are that I am an NPC, soy boy, beta cuck, I'm not particularly interested in engaging. I'm just not. But the first part is very interesting, which is why is there this hyper focus on masculinity and identifying who is masculine, who is not masculine? I think this actually relates to, the part of the obsession from the right about gay marriage and transgenderism is religiously based. Some of it is simply bigotry, but I actually think that a lot of it is connected to these preconceived notions and hangups on masculinity that the right has. And I don't know, Pat, why they're so obsessed with the degree of masculinity and who is the most masculine politician and this is alpha and that's beta. But it could be, one argument would be, this is something they are insecure about, and thus it becomes like a primary narrative. Even the sort of, I know people will say not all men's rights activists are right wing, but men's rights activism is more on the right than it is on the left. Even that, I feel like, is based in perceived sort of shortcomings that they perceive about themselves when it comes to masculinity. I don't know what the source of it is. We could say it's religion. We could say it's educational. I don't know, but it is an obsession.
And isn't it odd or ironic that they all view Trump as their alpha male to whom they must be subservient at all times? And I guess Trump really isn't all that alpha, too. He did miss that World War I ceremony because of rain, after all. And dodged the Vietnam War, 5 deferments, all that stuff. But yeah, I don't think they have a very even standard when it comes to that sort of stuff.
No, they certainly don't. And this is a problem that they have, and it's something we should explore in more detail. I'm out of time. Great bonus show today. Hope to talk to you on the bonus show in mere minutes.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.